after the talks, but Laurel will need to depart to actually set up the happy hour that is happening after this. So if you have any burning questions to ask her, that was not an intentional pun. Bad. You should come to the happy hour and ask for your questions, and then we'll hold questions and have all of our speakers come up at the end. So without further ado, we have Laurel, and I'll introduce everyone else as they come up.
You have to excuse me, I'm on the tail end of a cold, like I think everybody else on campus. And yeah, just to reiterate, we are having a semi-regular fire happy hour networking time at Raleigh Brewing from 4:30 to 7 tonight. Everyone is welcome, even if you're just a student who's taken a class or just come to this, definitely come on down and have a beer or not a beer if you're not that sort of person. So I work over in Extension Forestry in the College of Natural Resources, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we do over there relative to fire. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of public-facing, landowner-facing programming that we do just really quick. And then I'll talk about my work coordinating outreach for a group called the Southern Fire Exchange, talk a little bit about one of the issues we've been really involved in over the past couple of years, and then relate it back to climate change because I promise that it does relate. So just a couple of the sort of things we've been focusing on. We do a lot of fire work over in Extension Forestry. Myself and my colleague, Jen Fawcett, are both 100% full-time on projects related to wildland fire, although we do cover the entire Southeast. So some of the things we've been focusing on include these learn and burn workshops where private landowners can come out for the day and actually get hands-on experience conducting a prescribed fire under the supervision of professionals who can give them advice and mentorship. We've done a lot of these fire education days, fire festivals. You can see there's a good picture from one there. These are just family-friendly, public-facing events trying to build support for prescribed fire, particularly in areas where they may be burning around communities or burning in areas where they have it for a long time. We, of course, write publications, and we have a couple online training courses, again, mostly for private landowners, focused on getting them additional training to use prescribed fire on their land or get them to the next step of whatever that means for them. But half of my time is spent coordinating outreach for a group called Southern Fire Exchange. Have any of you heard of us? I know Joe has because he coordinates. So we are the South's representation of the Fire Science Exchange Network, which is federally funded. And our job essentially is to connect fire scientists in the research institutions and managers on the ground and make sure that the research that's getting done is actually getting used and is accessible to managers in a way that they understand. And that doesn't mean research papers for most of them. And we also feed that information back to the researchers in the institutions and make sure that they understand what managers on the ground would like research to look at for them. And so one of the issues we've been working a lot on the past couple of years is what we call the Duff Problem. And so I have to put Homer on there, obviously, his Duff. But what we mean when we say the Duff Problem is this phenomenon that happens when you exclude fire from these stands, longleaf pine and also other southern pines, for which fire is a really important maintainer of those ecosystems. And this isn't isolated to the Southeast. This problem occurs in a lot of other species like ponderosa pine, but I'll be talking specifically about what that looks like in the South. So we all know, I think most of us know at least, that in longleaf and other southern pine stands, fire is that really important maintainer that comes through every couple of years, keeps the underbrush and the forest floor fairly bare and open. But when you exclude fire from these stands pretty quickly, 10 years or less in a lot of places, particularly Florida and Georgia and Alabama, that duff layer starts to accumulate. All of those pine needles and hardwood litter and bark slough start to build up on the forest floor. And they start to decay on the bottom part of that layer. And so any manager that comes to one of these stands says, okay, well, we need to get prescribed fire back into that stand, restore fire to this ecosystem, which is true, you do, but the problem is that around those trees that are existing in the stand, particularly the larger, older trees, that duff layer starts to accumulate and form these mounds. And when those mounds are ignited through a prescribed fire, particularly one where there hasn't been super careful consideration for the fire parameters, that mound starts to smolder, it kills off the feeder roots of that tree, and about 12 to 18 months often later, you see things that look like this. And what looked like a really successful prescribed fire actually turns into overstory mortality of 80% plus of your larger trees. And so this leads to a big conundrum for managers because you do need to restore fire to these stands. You need to restore it not only to restore the ecological value of these stands, but also to prevent damage from wildfires, because it's really tricky to get prescribed fire back into these stands. And if a wildfire comes through, you're pretty much screwed. You've probably lost all of your larger trees. So you have to restore prescribed fire, but how do you do that in a way that's going to retain at least most of those older, more ecologically valuable trees? So this issue came to the forefront of our understanding a couple years ago as something that managers were saying, hey, we're really struggling with this. What do we do? And it turns out that the Joint Fire Science Program had actually funded quite a lot of research in this area. There was a good bit of information, good research done on why these trees were dying and some things that managers could do to try and prevent that. So over the past couple of years, we've been doing a lot of work to get that information, again, into avenues that are intelligible for the management community. So that's included a couple workshops across the Southeast in Florida and North Carolina. That's included writing a fact sheet about it. That's one of our most popular, people use all the time. We have recordings from these workshops and from a webinar that we did available on our YouTube channel that are still watched frequently. And we're planning to do more with this because as we've done all of this, demand has only increased. All of these workshops have been filled up with a wait list. People really need to hear about this topic. So we're planning more workshops, and these workshops are ones where we actually bring the researchers who are doing this work into a room with the managers and talk together about what the research says, and also from the management perspective, what that really means in practice. So we're putting together additional materials for managers on this topic, including probably a video and some sort of management tree decision guide. And I think most importantly, we have planned at the end of May in South Carolina what we're calling a Duff co-production summit, where we're going to bring together the researchers working on this and some managers who have a lot of experience working on this in North and South Carolina, at least, together to talk about where are next steps that the research needs to go to help managers answer their next questions about this issue, and what sort of publications, information can we as science communicators put together that's going to help managers that they don't already have based on the research that's currently available. There's no pictures. And so I think this does matter a lot when you start thinking about our climate change future. Our burn windows are narrowing. We know that according to the fourth climate assessment and other sources, that as the climate continues to change, weather patterns are going to continue to change, and what we know as a good burn window is going to become increasingly less common. So we need more tools, we need more weather parameters, and we need more managers who are experienced working in those conditions. I didn't really get into some of the solutions to dealing with stands with heavy duff loads, but they do generally include burning just really on the limits of when is possible to get combustion. And increasingly, those are going to be the sort of windows that are available to burners. So these are this is the sort of experience we need to get managers having, and these are the sort of tools that we need to develop now. Wildfire risk is also increasing. We all, I think, mostly know that that's true. And again, wildfire is a huge risk to these stands. And a lot of times you're talking about stands that are maybe a rare remnant old growth stand that hasn't been logged, or stands with mature trees, particularly longleaf, that are really ecologically valuable that we don't want to lose. And I think most importantly, it's really important to build these relationships between scientists and managers and the information sources they trust. Because again, as the climate continues to change and as conditions continue to change faster and faster, those connections have to already be in place so that we can respond efficiently, because we can't afford to build those connections as these problems are continuing to arise. And I think this picture, it's not a great picture, but it's a really cool example of what this looks like in practice. The day before our recent North Carolina workshop, these are some of the researchers who do this work, as well as some really great experienced managers from a couple different states out at a tract that's owned by the City of Fayetteville Public Works Commission. And it's one of very, very few old growth unlogged longleaf stands left in the state. And it also hasn't been burned in a long time. And it's also right within the outer limits of the City of Fayetteville with houses all around. It's a really, really tricky, really challenging stand that they really want to get fire back into before someone accidentally lets a wildfire loose and they lose all of those really valuable trees. So they had a really cool, great conversation about how to do that from a managerial perspective. Those scientists and those managers are still keeping in touch about how to make that happen moving forward. And so I will not actually take questions, jokes, but if you all end up at the happy hour later, or if you just have questions, my email's there, and feel free to get in touch.
Thanks, Laurel. Next up, we have Mr. Jason Sachs from the EPA, who agreed to join us on campus. And there we go.
Nice, thank you.
Great, it's nice to be here. I'm Jason Sachs. I'm an epidemiologist at the Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment. Anna Rappold was originally supposed to be here, but she regrets that she couldn't attend, but I'm happy to take her place. Just before I jump into the presentation, I need to display this standard EPA disclaimer. And so how often do wildfires impact air quality? One way to assess this is to take a look at the air quality index. For those of you not familiar with the AQI, it's a way that EPA is able to convey the daily state of air quality. So how clean or dirty is the air and the associated health risks. These are the various categories of the AQI. And when you look from a regional perspective, ozone and fine particles, or PM 2.5, account for a disproportionate number of unhealthy air quality days. And so in a recent study by Larson et al., they leveraged the air quality data to take a look at how often do wildfire events impact the unhealthy air quality categories. And so what they did was they obtained PM 2.5 and ozone monitoring data, along with information on smoke plumes from NOAA's hazard mapping system. And they used that information to assess the percentage of days during a smoke plume that contribute to the various codes of the AQI. And then they also examined how often do you, or what are the odds of experiencing each of the AQI categories on smoke plume days compared to non-smoke plume days. And so what they saw was that on smoke plume days for ozone, greater than 25% of those days accounted for unhealthy categories, and for PM 2.5, it was greater than 15%. But when you look at the odds ratios, you can see that on smoke plume days, the odds of experiencing an unhealthy air quality day are greater than you would get on a non-smoke plume day. And so, as you saw from the earlier slide, that wildfire smoke detrimentally impacts air quality. So, well, what do we know about the health effects of wildfire smoke? As I'm sure you're all aware, wildfire smoke is a complex mixture that contains both particles and gaseous pollutants, as well as water vapor. But of that complex mixture, the most significant component and the one that's of greatest public health concern is PM 2.5. And so our understanding of the effects of wildfire smoke span not only the growing body of literature that looks at health effects due to wildfire smoke itself, but also the significant literature base over the last few decades focusing on PM 2.5, but primarily in urban settings. And so the agency, along with a number of our partners, including some NGOs, we characterize the health effects of wildfire smoke in the Wildfire Smoke, a Guide for Public Health Officials. This is a document we often refer to as just the Wildfire Guide. And within this document, we're broadly characterizing the evidence, building on what we know about PM 2.5. And I feel within this document, taking a more precautionary approach of outlining what the health effects are. And I make this distinction because within another document that the agency develops, the Integrated Science Assessment for Particulate Matter, we take a much more rigorous approach to evaluating the evidence with respect to health effects. And I'll touch on that in the next slide. But for those of you that are not familiar with integrated science assessments, they form the scientific basis of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We completed the recent PM ISA in this past December. And so within the integrated science assessments, we take a systematic approach to evaluating the evidence. We use a weighted evidence approach where we're assessing the causal nature of relationships between health effects and PM exposures. And so within the document, we're organizing the information around broad health effect categories. And by broad categories, I mean respiratory effects or cardiovascular effects or mortality. The key to the document, though, is that we're integrating evidence across scientific disciplines. So we're looking at the health effects evidence, we're looking at atmospheric chemistry, exposure, and dosimetry. And we're seeing how all those lines of evidence fit together to inform a causality determination. And by causality determination, I mean we're using a 5-level hierarchy to determine what is our overall confidence in the relationship between exposure and a health effect, with a causal relationship being the highest category and no evidence of a causal relationship the lowest. And that's depicted on the right-hand side of the slide. This is a table of all the causality determinations for the health effect categories, exposure durations, and PM size fractions that we evaluated in the integrated science assessment. I'm not going to focus on it, but the asterisks and triangles are just representing that these conclusions changed from the last time we conducted the integrated science assessment in 2009. But I want you to focus on those categories of the darkest purple, and those are the categories where we concluded a causal or likely to be causal relationship. So that's our greatest confidence in that health effects exposure relationship. But when thinking about wildfire smoke, the areas that are of particular interest to us as we're evaluating this information and trying to figure out how this conveys to wildfire smoke exposures is the short-term PM 2.5 exposure, specifically for respiratory effects, cardiovascular effects, and mortality. And so although we have this really large evidence base looking at PM 2.5, and it definitely informs our understanding of wildfire smoke health effects, we still have a number of data gaps with respect to wildfire, particularly the range of health effects. We've seen ranging from symptoms all the way up to premature mortality. The exposure durations that are important for wildfire smoke. We don't have a lot of information on understanding repeated exposure, so experiencing high exposures to wildfire smoke on multiple days. Additionally, we don't know much about the impact of experiencing wildfire smoke, high exposures over multiple fire seasons. And lastly, we're still trying to gain an understanding of the impact of behavioral responses. What are the actions that people are taking to try and reduce their exposures to hopefully prevent health effects? And so a question that often arises, well, what's the public health impact of wildfire smoke exposure? And one way to assess this is looking at the health impacts and economic impacts due to wildfire smoke. And so this is a study that was conducted by Fan et al. In 2018, and they were able to demonstrate that wildfire smoke exposure could be responsible for thousands of hospital admissions and premature deaths. And this equates to an economic impact ranging from anywhere from $12 to $20 billion. And so unlike the national ambient air quality standards where we set a standard and actions are taken to try and reduce exposures to ultimately improve public health, for wildfires, we don't have a standard to try and reduce wildfire smoke exposure. And so one of the approaches that can be taken is hopefully through behavior change to try and get the population to engage in actions that could then minimize their exposures. And so one way that the agency has attempted to do this is through the development of the citizen science project, SmokeSense. And this was Anna's brainchild. The feature of SmokeSense that is core to the citizen science aspect is its vision for a two-way interaction communication framework. And SmokeSense scales up the approaches and methods of other projects that have a large community participatory aspect to them. The goal of the project is to enable entry points for both individuals and communities to not only contribute to research projects, but also to gain data. And this allows for a mutually beneficial relationship where EPA can get a better understanding of some of the population health effects that are being experienced due to wildfire smoke. And then communities can also gain information on how they can communicate the risks to the population. And so SmokeSense is a smartphone app that's available on both Android and iOS operating systems. And the goal of the objective of SmokeSense is to reduce the public health burden of wildfire smoke, and also to address the gap between recommended actions and observe the public health outcomes that people are taking in response to wildfire smoke exposure. And so they've been through one pilot season. For this, they had about 30,000 people download the app. And the information they obtained from those individuals was that there was a strong interest in personally relevant data. And this led to increased participation by these individuals that downloaded the app and reporting of symptoms that they experienced during a wildfire event. The way the app is structured is that you can say whether or not you're having a runny nose or your eyes are bothering you, and they're able to collect that information. The interesting part is that even though people were using the app and participating in providing this information, it was not driving them to engage in health protective behavior. The reported symptoms that people were providing were not due to personal risk factors. So what I mean is if someone had a pre-existing respiratory condition, it wasn't necessarily that they were reporting another respiratory condition due to wildfire smoke exposure. And overall, the conclusions were that people were responding to the symptoms, they were reacting, they were not taking measures to try and prevent themselves from having symptoms due to wildfire smoke. And so in conclusion, I just want to note that these are a number of resources that the EPA has with respect to wildfire smoke and for both public health officials, for physicians. The one that's not on here is we recently developed another continuing medical education course, wildfire smoke and your patient's health. So we have one that's focused on particle pollution, and then we also have a new one that's focused on wildfire smoke. So happy to take questions during the panel.
Thank you, Jason. Next up, we have Shannon McGovern and Elliot Nauert from the Fire Chasers Group here on campus. They are housed in public policy and are going to share with us what their research group does.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here on behalf of the Fire Chasers. My name is Shannon McGovern,
And I'm Elliot Nauert.
and we're going to be talking about the Fire Chasers research on understanding differences in risk perception to improve the co-management of wildfires. We are housed in the School of Public and International Affairs. Our PI is Dr. Brandon Noel. We have co-PIs at Duke University, Virginia Tech. We have a collaborator up at Chicago, and Elliot and I are the two graduate students on the team.
Yeah, so I'm actually not in public international affairs, come from psychology, but I started working as a firefighter in 2009, which is about the same time that the Fire Chasers started studying wildfire too. So from very different perspectives, we've been looking at wildfire for about a decade now. And no matter what perspective you take, even over that short span of time, there are a few trends that really stood out. That fires are getting bigger, the extreme fires are becoming more extreme, and there are longer fire seasons. So this is recognized a while ago in the biophysical sciences. The public is starting to recognize it and connect it to climate change through witnessing catastrophic fire events like the Australian wildfires a couple months ago. And practitioners too are feeling the effects. So for example, the US Forest Service for the first time in 2015, over 50% of their budget was allocated to wildfire related activities. And they expect that proportion to continue to grow. So these trends are affecting practitioners' ability to do their jobs. Overall, together what they're showing us is that wildfire incidents, while fires actually on the ground burning, are becoming more complex overall. So small fires used to be managed by the one governing body that managed that particular piece of land, and they could decide what the objectives were and how to achieve them. But what we see today is that fires are more frequently crossing many jurisdictional boundaries, and thus there are multiple stakeholders that are involved in any one incident. So we're interested in trying to look at how these changing trends in fire affect practitioners' ability to manage incidents, because what this would look like on the ground is that we're able to protect a more diverse set of people that are affected by any one incident and the things that they care about. And so one of the key terms that is important for the way that we look at this problem is co-management. So it's this process where now this diverse set of actors has to work collectively to manage an incident and make decisions. And that comes with its own set of inherent complexities.
Correct. So to better understand how to co-manage a wildfire, we need to understand the three factors that can create tensions and ultimately lead to conflict in an incident. First, by nature, wildfires are interdependent, which means the actions taken in one jurisdiction have consequences for other jurisdictions. Second, jurisdictions have competing objectives. They want different things prioritized. And third, based on the current system, how it's currently set up, individual jurisdictions have the ability to make unilateral decisions to benefit their jurisdiction that, again, impacts other jurisdictions. We call this the conflict cocktail. The theoretical solution to resolve the conflict cocktail is to use these points of leverage, but unfortunately, reducing jurisdictional interdependence is actually really hard to do during an incident. So we're going to focus on the sharing the decision space and increasing the alignment of objectives. We're going to do this through talking about risk perception and governance structures that can be used during while co-managing a wildfire event?
Yeah, so going off the conflict cocktail and then previous work that's been done in public management, our current project focuses on risk perception because that relates to competing objectives. If you have a really diverse set of actors that represent a diverse set of interests, then there's a higher chance that you'll have competing objectives and a higher chance of conflict. Similarly, governance structures, there are a set of tools that we use to organize a diverse set of actors to manage an incident. And we're not quite sure if those tools that we've been using for a long time are really up to the task of managing these new complex incidents. So the way that we have been doing that is we looked at 15 of the most complex fires in 2017 and 2018, and we conducted 137 interviews and surveys with some of the main decision makers involved in these incidents.
People like this. So the question is, how does risk perception differ among these various stakeholders and jurisdictions on an incident? Our analysis, we interviewed federal, tribal, state, local, and private interests, and we did within and across case analysis of the risk narratives using thematic coding. We looked at the variation between groups. What we expected to find was that there was going to be a divergence in what people cared about, the substantive categories. But in fact, we actually found really great alignment in the things that people cared about, but there was variation in the perception of the immediacy of the risk, so the temporal scale. The substantive categories are things like human safety, homes and infrastructure and communities, the ecosystems and the environment, and then social, political, and economic risks. And our temporal scale didn't load, but it's broken into 3 time scales. So it's immediate and tactical risk, incident level risk, and then long-term risk. Oh, there it is. So to look at our results, this bar chart, imagine it's flipped on its side and we combined 5 different charts into one. So we're comparing bars of the same color to themselves, like to each other, and not to bars of different colors, okay? So for the private landowners, they expressed the greatest concern about long-term economic impacts, particularly economic impacts. For the federal landowners' narratives, it focused mostly on immediate tactical risk to firefighter safety. The state landowners focused the greatest attention on immediate public safety. And for local governments, there was no single risk that was most salient in their narrative, which means that there was no statistical difference for the local government between incident level, immediate tactical risk to firefighter safety, and then immediate destruction and disruption.
Yeah, so overall with those findings about risk perception, we're kind of telling us is that there are some differences in how people perceive risk on the dimension of what is an immediate priority and what is not. But there's actually a lot of alignment in what they are concerned about the most. And so when it comes to co-management, that commonality would be a good foundation to have productive conversations during an incident. And so that leads us to our next question, which is, how are the current tools that we use to manage an incident going to facilitate or impede managers' ability to have conversations where they can figure out what they are aligned on and where they're different? So the formal system for managing wildfires in the US is called the Incident Command System. And I'm not going to be able to go into too much detail about this, and you're all probably thankful for that. There are 2 formal systems that are used under ICS: Joint Delegation of Authority and Unified Command. So we look at these 2 formal systems, or these organizations, and then also what we call ad hoc coordination, which is informal systems that usually happen for lower level actors. So instead of the higher level decision makers kind of negotiating with each other, it all happens at a lower level. And basically the main difference between all of these exists in how communication, negotiation, and authority is dispersed among the various actors. And so each one of them does have different capacities for facilitating co-management. So what we did was took our interviews and we looked at the degree to which individual actors felt that their concerns were incorporated into the ultimate decision-making process. And we looked at how this differed depending on what kind of organization structure that they were using. So the 2 formal structures are joint delegation. We also had a hybrid, because sometimes both organizations kind of happen at different times of the incident, and then unified command. And you can see that in those formal structures, there was the most highest percentage of people saying that they had voice. Their concerns were heard in the decision-making process. Down here, the ad hoc kind of informal structures had the highest degree of no voice, but not that much more than the others. There was a mixture. Sometimes they felt that they had voice, and sometimes they felt that they had voice totally or to a mixed degree. And so overall, what this told us was that, yes, the formal structures do seem to be the most effective for allowing voice, perception of voice within the actors, but there's still a high degree of using informal ad hoc structures. And at least in some cases, that is an effective approach to use. So all of that kind of goes into the core proposition of what our current work is, which is that we believe that the more formal representation you have in the organization, so if there's a formal role for you in the organization of the incident management team, then you will perceive that you have voice. You think your concerns were heard. But we've seen that there are some strengths and weaknesses to the formal structures we're using, and there are some strengths and weaknesses to the lower level informal structures. So what our current work is doing is looking at when the macro structures, these formal ones, work and when they don't work, and when those smaller level structures work and when they don't work.
So the big takeaways: due to the nature of fire, there will be tension, and if it is not managed appropriately, it will lead to conflict. And in order to ease those tensions, we should utilize the 3 points of leverage, particularly the 2 during the incident, and then the reducing jurisdictional interdependence before an incident. And then the big takeaways for risk perception: there was great alignment in the things people cared about, but their perceived immediacy differed. And that influences their focal objectives, what they want to prioritize. And so if we're going to use these points of leverage to reduce tension, we need to understand how people perceive risk and what they care about to balance trade-offs and make decisions.
And then again, looking at the structures that people use to communicate those differences or alignments and risks and figure out what the objective should be. The formal structures we're using are working, but not all the time. And there are other structures that seem to have some pieces that would be beneficial for making sure that more voices heard more of the time as the complexity of actors involved increases. And especially given the fact that all these different actors may be involved at different points in the incident itself. And so we may need to find some sort of more flexible structure, and that's where we're heading in the next part of our work.
So thank you.
Thanks, Shannon and Elliot. And our last presenter is Dr. Rob Scheller from Forest Environmental Resources. And he is going to share a little bit about what our lab does and how we think about fire into the future.
Good. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, well, so we expect our future landscapes are going to be radically different. Of course, we're here talking about wildfires. So wildfire is going to be one of those driving forces that change our landscapes, but not the only factor. Insects and pathogens are going to be a huge player. Climate change, of course. Land use changes are huge here in the Southeast. Even market forces, you know, what's driving deforestation in Brazil is largely meat demand in Southeast Asia. And then human adaptation to all of the above. Humans are never passive recipients of change, but always respond to change and make the landscape suit their needs, or try to make the landscape suit their needs. I really like the concept of trajectories for thinking about landscape futures. I enjoy both thinking about past trajectories as well as future landscapes trajectories. And you think about a trajectory, you have to think about what is your starting position, what is the state of the landscape today, and what are the land use history factors that created those conditions today, what is the direction, which direction is the landscape headed, as well as its momentum. What is the inertia behind the system? How hard will it be to change that trajectory? How much effort will have to go into altering those trajectories? And so, of course, the fear is with all these changes that we're going to have reduced landscape values or ecosystem services delivered by our landscapes, right? So radically different landscapes mean less of the things that we expect from our landscapes. And, on one hand, we could simply accept that, right? Accept reduced delivery from our landscapes there. Or we can use management to try to ensure that our landscapes continue to deliver what we expect from them, what we need from them. And so, one of the big questions comes up is, well, must we be proactive? Do we have to manage for the future necessarily? Historically, humans have merely reacted to landscape change. But, I argue that we need to be much more proactive than we have been. First of all, the consequences are much higher than they have been in the past. So of course, we're concerned about habitat for critical or endangered species disappearing and species extinctions, loss or decline of ecosystem services that we depend on, irreversible change, the threat of going from grassland to desert and not being able to get back to grassland in any reasonable time frame. And so the questions that my team addresses, this is my team, Dynamic Ecosystems Landscape Plan. What are the threats to landscape health and what are the solutions? Which management approaches will be most effective and where will they be effective? And which landscapes are most amenable? We can't assume that we're going to be able to save every landscape under every circumstance. And so today I'm going to give a specific example from the Sierra Nevada. We've been doing work here for the last, how long has it been? 13 years. Of course, the Sierra Nevada, we've heard a lot about with fires, not just in Australia, a lot of fires in the Sierra Nevada lately. There's so many reasons why we want to protect the Sierra Nevada: endangered species, carbon, biodiversity, water quality, et cetera. I should point out, and I forgot to add logos, this work has been funded by the Forest Service, BLM, the Nature Conservancy, and others. And so, well, here we are, wildfire, right? And here's a picture. This is from the Paradise Fire, a few years ago. Of course, no one wants to see, loss of human life or human infrastructure. This is a large negative of a changing landscape. I do want to point out that that's not the only driver of landscape change. Because of climate change in this area, insects are actually causing more mortality in the forest than fire today. So insects are the major driver of forest mortality in the Sierra Nevada. But they don't get the press, do they? Because nothing looks quite as horrific as a bad fire. And so this is just the general setup that we're looking at. So we're concerned about wildfire and insects interacting with each other. We're thinking about climate change. How is that going to affect wildfire and insects? As well as management. Can we manage for climate change, wildfire, and insects? And we're projecting the future forest health. So we're doing forecasting. We're thinking out 50 to 100 years. How is this landscape going to change? And can we manage for this change? Can we prevent the worst from happening? And so this is just our general methods. So we start with a lot of data science, right? We have to get, what is the position of that trajectory today? So we use a lot of data science to determine current conditions. And we use stakeholder input, as was touched on by the other speakers, and I'll touch on again at the end. Really, stakeholder engagement is everything. We need our stakeholders, we need their knowledge, and we need their buy-in in order for this to be successful. And then we have a landscape change model that we've developed here at NC State, which is a very large, complex model similar to weather forecasting, right? You take some current conditions, you plug it into the model, and you're doing some forecasting. Rather than 10 days out, we're doing 10 decades out into the future. And then we get our projections of future change. We really emphasize wildfire as a social ecological phenomena. So we really have to think of wildfire beyond the simple physical and ecological interactions. Human ignitions dominate worldwide, and particularly in this landscape that we're looking at, the Sierra Nevada. Fire suppression limits fire extent, fire treatment limits fire severity. But at the same time, management is primarily focused on that infrastructure. So when forest managers are managing fire, they're really focused primarily around human lives and human infrastructure. And of course, humans are causing climate change, which is the primary driver here on this landscape. Okay, so I'm just going to cut to the chase. What have we learned over 13 years? First of all, wildfire management can be effective despite climate change. Like we've seen, you put more effort into it and you get positive results. Management can bend that trajectory towards a more positive outcome. But in order to do so, it really needs to be extensive and committed. And extensive, I mean, we need to stop thinking about just managing right around the wildland-urban interface. We need to manage the entire landscape for fire. And committed means, you know, it's not going to be a quick 20-year, get in there and manage for fire and then let it go. This is going to have to be sustained management for decades into the future, if not forever. And number 3, despite all these efforts, there are some circumstances, if we start looking at that, you know, the highest emissions concentration pathways, where all the management in the world may fail. There is some chance of complete failure if we let our emissions get away from us. And these will no longer be forests into the future under those circumstances, regardless of how much we commit to it. What we do see also is ecosystem trade-offs are going to be really large. So we're going to do this management, and there's going to be large trade-offs that we're going to have to make. We're going to have to sacrifice some landscape values for others. And last, as pointed out, stakeholder engagement is really the key to changing policy and action. That, you know, we've done a lot of work here, and it's so much work. You have to have so many meetings with your stakeholders, but this is absolutely essential, that they are engaged from the beginning, the middle, and the end. If you don't understand, you know, what are their management ideas and what kind of data they need, you just wasted a lot of time doing a lot of forecasting. So this is all very stakeholder driven. All right, thank you.
All right, if we could give a resounding another round of applause to everyone. We're gonna have the panelists come up. Awesome. Intense. Good, good. Yeah, so we're going to have people asking questions potentially online as well as in the room. So if your question's coming from the back, make sure to project, or we'll probably repeat it. And then if there's questions online, Katie, just throw your hand up. Right here.
So I've got a question primarily for Jason. So you were talking about smokestacks or app for citizen science with wildfire smoke. So I was just wondering exactly kind of how does that work on the user side of things? Are they reporting symptoms? Are they reporting, you know, smoke amount, aerosol extinction? Like what kind of variables are you getting through that?
They're reporting symptoms. There's a checklist in there. They can click off the different symptoms that they're experiencing. And then ultimately down the road, the idea is to conduct an epidemiology study using the data that's coming out of there. But right now, they're just looking at what type of information they're getting from the people that are reporting, and what are the types of behaviors that they're engaging in.
Yeah, one more back here.
So I'll ask Jason also. For the 2.5 ppms, what's the ambient level?
So across the US, I guess there's two ways to answer that. The first is the National Air Quality Standard, the annual, so the yearly one is 12 microgram per meter cube. The daily is 35. And so nationally, most locations from an annual standpoint are around 10, to be honest. But the daily can vary. In wildfire events, it can be anywhere, it could be over 150, it could be up to over 200. It just depends on how big of a wildfire event it is.
So one other question that goes along with that. So if you're doing atmospheric dispersion modeling, how far out do these particles go?
Oh, they can travel really far. I mean, when you look at some of the smoke plume data, they're traveling over states. And so it varies how big. I mean, some of the bigger fires from Canada traveled all the way down to Boston, New York. So I mean, it can go really far.
Also, Jason. I was also curious about that dichotomy you're seeing between people reporting your symptoms but not necessarily engaging with the behavior that's recommended. What are some of those, what are, as an example, behavior that you would recommend somebody look at?
So like in the wildfire guide, we provide actions that people can take. So, staying indoors, having a HEPA filter, in a lot of communities where they are experiencing wildfire events, they'll have clean air shelters. And so those types of behaviors versus, having the windows open in your house or playing outside or those types of activities.
I got one for Rob. So Rob, what kind of policies are you proposing to actually make a change?
Yeah, we really need to focus on really landscape scale thinning of these forests, reducing both, insects feed off of dense forests as well as crown fires. So if you reduce forest density back to, a century, where they were a century ago, you're going to have much greater resilience to droughts, to reduce drought mortality, reduce insect mortality, and you're not necessarily going to stop fire spread, but you will reduce the crown fire incident. So again, it needs to be the entire landscape, even though people are resistant to that idea, and it needs to be sustained well into the future.
So comparing the west, where you've been working, and comparing the east, where we're living, where west is about 80% publicly owned land, national forest.
Yeah.
The east is about the same privately owned forests. Do you think there's any chance of anything happening, enough investment going into the west to actually make it feasible, whereas in the south, people are doing it by themselves?
So will it happen in the West? Yes. California is planning to spend $500 million for the next 20 years or so on doing these sort of management actions. And what they're paying us to do is figure out what are the optimal, right? If you're going to spend $500 million, you want to spend it wisely. So what is the optimal policy? And made some broad generalizations, but you can focus on some areas more than other areas. There's questions about timing and intensity that we try to answer.
I have a question for Sharon and Elliot. When you're talking about those jurisdictions and like how the actions in one jurisdiction affects others, do those include any like lands, like tribal lands, or people that might be doing fire activities that you don't necessarily think about? How were they included in your study and how did they respond?
Sure. Yeah. So the people that we actually interviewed, kind of the criteria was that they had to be have a certain degree of like authority or be involved in the upper level decision making. And so there were some tribal jurisdictions that were involved because of that, but not many. I think it was a total of 3 or something like that.
It was a very small number,
Yeah.
which does speak to the issue, are they being included in the conversations?
Yeah, and so there were a few instances where we, in other interviews with other people, tribal actors were identified. They had lands that they had a stake in that were affected by these fires, but they had no actual authority to govern those lands, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's a really interesting question, and unfortunately, we don't have enough to be able to speak to that, but you see it come up in some interesting problems.
Well, I just wanted to ask you, any of you on the panel, what have we moved the needle at all in human acceptance of more fire management as one option to reduce massive fires? So if people embrace the idea of smaller scale prescribed burns, can then that lead the public to understand that if we do that, then we can maybe eliminate large, massive Australian paradise fire type fires. And so what are the challenges, I guess, with communities? Obviously, we're a growing population, land use change, air quality for humans. What challenges do we need to address in terms of the human perception of embracing management options to reduce massive fires?
I think you just touched on one of them. So in the West, there's this trickle down. I think the agencies are all very much behind, more prescribed fire. And the communities are starting to accept it, particularly as you see all these, problems in the West, to put it mildly. But, you know, the trade-off, if you start doing prescribed fires, is it does create air quality problems. And so you run into this, you know, they really want to get the fire out there, but then, you know, it's a weekend and people are visiting their mansion in Lake Tahoe and they don't want the smoke. You know, there's this pushback against doing some of these activities.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of issues on the air quality side. One is, how do you convey to the public what's happening? And you know, a lot of states that we've had conversations with are concerned, you know, if a prescribed fire gets out of control and the concentrations get high, they're in violation of the standard. And so that's an issue that they have to grapple with. But I think a lot of it is the communication side of how do they convey to the public what's happening, what are the potential risks they need to convey to the public, and how do they go about doing it?
Do you think we have enough agencies in manpower capacity to do that? I mean.
The communication side?
Yeah.
There's lots of discussions going on of how to convey the benefits of prescribed fire. There's a lot of federal agencies involved, and I think there's a clear difference in the eastern and western U.S. too with respect to prescribed fire. And so I think trying to figure out why is it more acceptable in some locations versus others, and trying to bridge that gap to convey why, you know, the benefits of it.
I was curious on that, like how much research, like a big wildfire has to be much worse air quality wise for like the footprint of that, or the air print. And how much research is there to show like cost benefits of like this small smoke event versus a very large smoke event in terms of human health impact?
Wildfires are really challenging to study. From the standpoint of, when you think about designing an epidemiology study, a lot of the air pollution ones, you're looking at multiple years of data. And so now you're honing in on, okay, you might have a couple months. And so often you don't have the power to even examine whether or not you're seeing health effects. And so some of the recent studies that actually Anna has been involved with is that they're taking all the fires over a series of years and grouping all that data together to try and see, okay, what are some of the health effects that we're seeing due to wildfires? I think then translating it to the cost benefit side, again, is where we're trying to make sure that we have the health studies to be able to input that into some of these models that are able to then estimate the health impacts and economic impacts.
Complicated, but it's not a long-winded. And this is someone who wants to propose a comment or a comment from a blog post and get some comments on it. So this is from a post called "No More Prescribed Fire Barriers: Lessons from Lamprey" by Lena Quinn Davidson. And the comment is, "I can tell you that personality, perspective, and culture easily top the list of prescribed fire barriers, from the practitioner on the ground all the way up to our state and federal leaders. It may be that we need psychologists in addition to social scientists to truly grasp the complexity of this field." So they request comments on that, especially from maybe the fire chaser group who may be in this.
I think that's the beautiful thing about the fire chasers. Sorry if I cut you off, but I was going for it. I think that's the beautiful thing because Branda is a community psychologist. Toddy Steelman at Duke is the dean of the environmental school. Annalisa Dr. Velez at Virginia Tech studied how to preserve historical sites in fires. And then Kate up in Chicago studies network governance. Elliot's in psychology, I'm in public administration. And so it's a really cool blend of all these ideas to look at the issue of how do we better co-manage incidents from so many different perspectives. And so I agree that you need to have a lot of people included in the conversation to make sure you're seeing the full picture, but there also becomes a point of diminishing marginal return where you get too many people and you can't get things done.
I've got a question. So for Elliot and Shannon, it sounded like the talk that you gave focused on wildfires as the incident and kind of reacting in the moment. How do those formal structures and informal structures work? Do you have any comment on conversations that those managers are having about prescribed fire? Do you have any gauge for, are they in agreement, or like if my jurisdiction over here burns, is this jurisdiction aware of kind of the relationship and how it might impact or be dependent?
Yeah, so one of we had an interview protocol, and part of that was asking about, one, how well they knew each other ahead of time, neighboring jurisdictions, and what kind of conversations they had had ahead of time. And given these fires that we were asking them about, how have those conversations changed? And it turns out that for the most part, and this is mostly my loose interpretation, no analysis here, but they don't talk much beforehand, especially when you get into different jurisdictional levels. So like federal versus state versus local kind of thing. And I'm sorry, and so you were asking specifically about prescribed fire?
Yeah,
so
planning.
Yeah, so we ask what kinds of things they've talked about before fire season. Are you doing more to prepare for fire season? And from without any analysis, it looks like that there's not much talk about that. Most of the talk in preparing for fire season is, okay, I'll have these resources around. If you ever need help, then we can provide these for you. But all of those, even within one level of jurisdictions, like all the federal agencies, do seem to have very different approaches for long-term management, like specifically prescribed fire. But that's one thing that we're trying to encourage, is have more of those pre-fire season conversations, so that by the time things are hitting the fan, then you're more in alignment about what needs to be done now, and you've worked together to prepare the whole landscape ahead of time too.
All right, we have 1 more minute. Okay, question? Yeah, go ahead.
Are there instances where damage caused by other ecological factors, such as the insects in the Sierra Nevada, have been commandeered to garner more public interest in wildfires or prescribed fires?
Good question. Maybe, the insects are, they're the silent killer, right? They never get good press. But what does is, in addition to fire, is flooding. So particularly where you have fire on near rivers, on steep slopes, the erosion can be fantastic, and that can really cause downstream negative consequences. So all these rivers feed into the Central Valley. And so there are really large repercussions if the fire is in the wrong place in a watershed. So yeah, I think that would be the case where these other factors highlight the risk of fire.
It's really raining outside. We don't have to leave right this second.
But there's free beer waiting for us.
I don't think it's raining.
Awesome. Well, thank you to our speakers. Thank you guys for